Welcome to ABC, Adult Bible and Catechism, a summer 2020 offering of faith formation by Good Shepherd Lutheran Church. It's a series of weekly presentations that will aid you in your understanding of the Lutheran Christian faith and how it affects the way you see life through the lens of faith in Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining us again this week. Let's begin with this week's presentation.
Hey everybody, if you don't know what to do when I say that, you got to watch the one before this. Anyway, we're going to continue on a little bit with the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. Moses' kind of coup de grace, so to speak, on his ministry. So we started out talking a little bit about Genesis and the creation stories, how there's a couple of different ones, and then what happens, when sin comes into the world and kind of the original sin, so to speak. And I'm not quite sure if it was the original sin or not. I don't know if I like that terminology, but kind of how it all started and how separation from God came to be. That's one of the major points of the beginning few chapters of Genesis. It doesn't take us very quick to get into figuring out in Genesis that people are broken, that humanity is broken, and one of the things that God does with that is pull out somebody he feels is very righteous, tells him to build a big boat and take 2 of everything on it. So Noah builds the ark, and God kind of, that's his do-over, right? I think to some extent he felt bad about that because, when that was all said and done, then of course there's a rainbow and God promises to never do over again. I think that's where God started thinking about Jesus and being human. Anyway, that's just some of the thoughts that go through my head. So major characters and actors in Genesis are, of course, Adam and Eve in the creation stories. And then, the do-over with Noah. There's some great stories about Lot and destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a fairly violent book. There's a lot of people that die. But one of the major characters there is Abraham. Now, Abraham and Sarah didn't start out as Abraham and Sarah. They started out as Abram and Sarai, and God renamed them. It was kind of a new creation again. God continually creates. I don't like saying that Genesis is the story of creation because God creates over and over and over again in the Bible. God is constantly creating all the way up to the New Testament, where if anyone's in Christ, they're a new creation, and right up to the book of Revelation, where I saw a new heaven and a new earth. So creation happens all the time. But one of the central figures is Abram and Sarai, and God promised Abraham that he would make a great nation of him. Said that Sarah was going to have a baby. Sarah laughed because Sarah was very old. But they did. So at one point, I think Sarah took that into her own hands and said, I'm not going to have any babies because I'm really old. So Abraham, why don't you have a baby with Hagar, your slave girl, and we'll get this thing rolling that God said was going to happen, and we're going to have this great nation. So he did, and Ishmael was born. And God showed up and said, nah, that's not what I'm talking about, man. You got to listen. And one of the central points of all of Scripture is just listen to God. I mean, it's not our time, it's God's time, right? So don't get ahead of yourself and don't get ahead of God, right? God doesn't have a clock. He's eternal. So Abraham and Sarah did. They had Isaac. They did have this son. And then Sarah got jealous and sent Ishmael away. But Ishmael and Hagar went off into the wilderness, and they were kind of resigned to dying once they ran out of provisions. So Hagar set Ishmael down under a bush, and she went over to another bush, and they were just going to cry themselves to death, basically. And God showed up and said, no, the promise is for you as well. You'll make a great nation. And, making a long story short, some of you are saying too late. That's okay. But to make a long story short, Ishmael's kind of the Muslim side. So we could talk about that if you want. Anyway, then we quickly get into Exodus, which starts off with these plagues, right? So Israel, this community of people that the Old Testament is about, were kind of in slavery, and God picked on Moses and said, there's a whole backstory to that too. Moses, and he actually murdered an Egyptian when he was young. So God uses broken people to do things. He used Adam and Eve to start out, and they were broken. He used There's a whole bunch of ways that Abraham was broken. We could get into that if you want. I don't have time now, but Moses was a broken guy. I mean, he murdered an Egyptian, so he ran away, and God spoke to him in a burning bush and said, you know what, you're going to lead my people out of slavery. And Moses said, well, I don't talk very well. And God said, that's fine, take Aaron with you. Anyway, so they go, and he says, God says, you know what, I'll bring these plagues on, and I'll make Pharaoh let your people go. It's kind of a foundational story in our story of humanity, is this story of these plagues. So there was water to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, diseased livestock, boils all over everything. Ew, okay. Hail, locusts. If you've ever seen a locust, man, they're like grasshoppers like this, and they eat everything. And then darkness. Now those are the first nine, right? And every time he'd do that, Pharaoh would go, oh, okay, fine. You'll make this plague go away, and I'll let your people go. And Moses would say, okay, God, shut off the plague. And God would shut off the plague, and Pharaoh would go, nope, forget it. You're going to stay. Well, so finally God got tired of it, because, God gets tired of stuff. And God got kind of tired of it and said, you know what? You go tell Pharaoh you're going to have like one more plague, and this one's going to be the top of the heap here. But he said, before you do that, make sure you go and you tell your people, Israel, to prepare a meal in a certain way, and to take the blood of a lamb and dip hyssop branches in it and put it around the lintel and the doorpost. The lintel is the part of the frame that goes across the top. Paint it with blood, and then I'm going to send a plague where all the firstborn will die. But when my angels see the blood around the doorpost, they will pass over that house. Now, in my head, I like to think of that as a little like those Death Eaters in Harry Potter, right? These black, wispy, scary things are coming to kill all the firstborn. But you paint the blood around your posts. And the angel will pass over that house. Now that's where Passover comes from, okay? And that matters as we get into the New Testament and the Eucharist, or what we call communion, okay? That matters. That event right then, where the angel of death passed over those houses, that makes a difference. So you're going to want to remember that, okay? So anyway, Pharaoh had a kid. Of course, it was a firstborn, and that died too. So that really turned Pharaoh's head pretty sideways, and Pharaoh let Moses take the people and leave. There's a great story about Moses parting the Red Sea, and they run across, and then the sea comes back and kills a bunch of chariots and riders and horses. And I always feel bad about the horses, because they didn't do anything wrong. And then Moses and his people end up wandering around out in the wilderness for 40 years. And people grumbled, because at least back in slavery they had something to eat. But God never left them. God took care of them all through that wilderness wandering. There's a lot of wilderness wanderings in our life, and that story of the wilderness wandering makes us remember that God does not abandon us. God never abandoned his people. Sometimes he was silent, and sometimes, I think he looked down and said, you know what, you asked for this, you're going to experience it for a while. But especially when you get into kings, we prayed for a lot of kings. God says you don't need kings, and no, we did it anyway. So I think that they wandered in the wilderness. 40 years makes a difference. There's a lot of 40s in the Bible. 40 years is pretty much 2 generations. So basically what happened is he brought this little group of people. They wandered around in the wilderness long enough for the old to be gone and the new to be started. Okay, we're going to create something new. Again, God is always creating, all through the Bible, okay? So what did they have in this wilderness wandering? Well, they struggled with food, and they complained to Moses about food, and then all of a sudden manna, some kind of white flaky stuff, showed up on the grass, and they could make bread out of it. And then quail showed up, and they could eat quail and have bread, which I thought sounds really good. I don't know what they're complaining about. They had faith issues. They really struggled with what it means to be in relationship with God. So God called Moses up onto the mountain and gave him the 10 Commandments, said, here's how you live together. And of course, while he was gone, they were misbehaving. So he came down, got mad, and smashed them. So, there's the whole Ark of the Covenant thing, and I digress. Anyway, there were thirst issues. The thing about the thirst issues was, again, God looked at Moses and said, tap the rock, and water will come out. And Moses tapped the rock twice. The unfortunate thing is God showed up and says, I told you to tap the rock and water would come out. You didn't trust me. So what was Moses' punishment? He got to see the promised land across the river, but he didn't get to go. He had to let Joshua take his people to the promised land, and he had to stay, and he died there. Again, you know, God tells us things and kind of expects us to listen along, right? And then when we don't, it's not like, you know, every now and then God will just let us suffer those consequences. So there's that. All throughout the Old Testament, and it really starts in those first couple of books of the Bible, in Genesis and Exodus, this pattern develops. And the pattern is that God provides something, right, this beautiful garden. We mess it up. We sin. God punishes us. We ask for forgiveness. God forgives. It always happens. God forgives us, and it starts all over again. He gives us something. We mess it up. God punishes. We ask for forgiveness. God forgives. That pattern repeats itself ad nauseum in the Old Testament. It's over and over and over again. Through almost every book in the Old Testament, there's that pattern. You can find it. And that's why I think when we get to the point where we start talking about the New Testament becoming the Old Testament, that's where God says, you know, you people aren't listening. I'm just going to come down there and show you how it's done. Okay, so that's Genesis and Exodus. You get to Leviticus. Leviticus is the law book. If you really want some interesting reading, read through Leviticus, and there's 600 and something laws in there that people often cite to kind of illustrate an exclusion, right? If you do these things, God won't love you, kind of thing. And of course, that's not true at all. I mean, one of them is you can't pierce your body or get tattoos. Well, I have tattoos, so I'm off the bus. And ladies, if you got pierced ears, you're done. A couple of them that I bring up in confirmation. Another one is you can't eat meat with blood in it. So if you like your steak medium or less, you're off the bus. You can't wear clothes with more than one fabric in them. So if you got a cotton poly shirt on right now, sorry, you're out. And then, guys, you can't cut the hair on your temples. I don't know. And then, ladies, you know, when you pray, you got to pray with a hat on. So, I mean, there's a lot of really odd little laws in there. And some of them, you know, just an example, right? At that particular time, they didn't have a lot of refrigeration and sanitation techniques. So cooking your meat until the blood was out of it was really a safety issue. As far as piercing your ears, right, there weren't any autoclaves, so there's no sanitation equipment. So it's kind of like it's a health issue. So there's a lot of ways you can figure out that the Levitical laws would function in that type of society. And I'm not saying that they aren't true today, but what I am saying is that there are ways that you can look at them in today's context and try and figure out what God was trying to do here. We obviously don't live in the time when Leviticus was written. The Bible moves with time. So try and get past like the written word a little bit and get to the spirit of what's written and how it functions in your life. So then you get into Numbers. There's a lot of generational stuff in there. Get past that. There's some pretty good information in there about, again, God getting together. And then Deuteronomy is kind of a switch over into or out of the Pentateuch. It's it's a transitional story. It's kind of where they go from that wilderness wandering into the new land that God promised. And of course, the next book after that is Joshua, because Joshua takes them over there. So the whole thing, the whole Pentateuch is about the formation of community. It's about creation over and over again and recreation of that community. Sometimes it gets destroyed and rebuilt again. Sometimes it doesn't behave and it has to be punished. If you want to look at it as the story of a little kid, it's the story of a little kid. It's the story of very juvenile faith and relationship with God, and God being a very juvenile parent. There's lots of very exact things. It's a little tough to reason with a 3-year-old as to why they shouldn't pick that lollipop up off the ground and just go ahead and eat it. It's the same thing. So I encourage you to read through those and understand that they're a foundation of the Bible. I encourage you to check out some of the other faith traditions and how they view that. go ahead and check out a Tanakh, a Hebrew Bible, and see, how that translation works with what we normally use as the New Revised Standard Version. Is kind of the one I use to teach from. So that's kind of a real 35,000 foot flyover of the first 5 books of the Bible, but it's essentially what that is about. So thanks for joining us. I'll see you down the road a little bit.